So, hi everyone. I'm here with Mark Morrall and Ian Simpson today. They're from Indigo Cloud. Mark's the MD, and Ian's in charge of business development and client relationships. And Indigo Cloud are in the sort of like the SaaS collection system type market, and they've got their own product they've been working on. So both of you, thanks very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it, and welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
I mean, I suppose the reason why I was kind of keen to chat to you really was, we've seen quite a lot of change in the market over the last 5 years, where there's been sort of like this big change and move away from what were really kind of like large collection systems and these like newer collection systems being developed in the background. It's become a very dynamic market, with sort of like new providers and new systems sort of nipping on the heels of really what were quite established. Providers before, and I suppose, and as one of those sort of smaller providers or newer providers, I would say, what are some of the things you're seeing in terms of like where you think there's an opportunity in the market, some of the things that maybe aren't being delivered, where you think that this kind of approach is really why it's really having success?
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Chris, by using the words, the larger ones, the monolithic suppliers. They were the people who were dominating the market for many years, and they're servicing a much, much larger sort of enterprise level clients. So your big clearing banks or whatever. But what we've kind of found is that our product is 100% cloud based, so the kind of the flexibility and the agility that you get from that is very different to the kind of service that you get when you buy a large on-site installed server. The move with the cloud-based technology, you've gone from sort of containerized, if you want to call it that, services that you have on a server that sits in your basement, in your or in your IT service room. You then had moved to like a slightly more microservices where you've got that, but it integrates with other things. And now you're, such as Indigo Cloud, Mark can talk much more about this than I can, entirely serverless, sitting 100% and wholly in the cloud. And that allows companies with a lot less sort of physical footprint, and certainly a lot less people, to be able to get to the same kind of services that would have been provided by the bigger ones in the past.
How much are you seeing the environment kind of change as a result of the pandemic? So certainly you couldn't access the server room, or it wasn't as easy to be able to do it. People were in the office to be able to provide the support, like direct support. I mean, and it feels like there's been this sort of big move to the cloud, and it's sort of been enabled by that. I know it was there before, but it feels like that was a bit of a turning point in terms of like people were looking for things to be set up quickly and sort of get on stream with digital services quickly. I mean, do you think has that been a big enabler? I mean, have you been seeing that more interest, really being driven by that?
Yeah, for sure. At the start of the first lockdown, in fact, during that first 6 months, we had a record number of inquiries, mostly from smaller businesses, to be fair. But it suddenly became apparent that they needed something, and this is the same throughout any industry, I think. They needed the ability to work from home very quickly. And as you said, the technology had always been there. But all of a sudden it was imperative, and we had a load of inquiries, a load of new customers come on board during that period.
Yeah.
And I think after that as well, what we've seen, not only just from the pandemic, but also sort of after it, is the distributed workforce and then distributed services are also becoming much more the model. You've had things like certain support services for collections, like sort of payments and payment methodology. Well, they've changed in 10 years all on their own anyway. The move away from kind of like a hard payment, if you like, so people sending in payments or people making cash, and moving to online payments, and also, to use the word millennials, you've got everybody who lives on their handheld devices now. It's much more the norm for payment. It's much more the norm for contact. I don't even, I'm not a millennial by any means, but I don't even carry a physical card around with me anymore. I pay for everything using my phone. And that's what we're kind of finding is also supporting the pandemic driven stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of reduces the requirement for for local infrastructure, right, as well.
Yeah.
So, for example, I'm thinking about, from an agent point of view, you had to have the right version of Java that was sitting on there. You had to have the right system that was on there. I mean, you remember all the conversations you used to have to go through in terms of like that sort of like network side of things versus browser based.
Yep.
I mean, is that coming up as being an advantage? Because I imagine you don't have to deal with any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's even go even further than that. We as an organization, we don't have a single physical server. Everything we do is on the cloud. All of our our product is obviously on the cloud, but all of our accounting packages, our CRM, everything we do is cloud based. We live and breathe on it. So it means for us, we literally don't need a technical IT department. We don't need people, engineers managing the networks and the servers and patching. We don't need to worry about the patching or any of that stuff. Obviously, the PCs need patching, and we manage that through cloud-based management tools as it happens.
Yeah.
And that's the same for our customers. In that, certainly a lot of the smaller businesses, I guess, you could spin up a business now in a matter of weeks you don't even need to worry about premises anymore, do you? You can work from home. You've got no network to worry about, no servers or anything, and then all of your software is just available, on a subscription basis. So, yeah, it's been a huge change over the last 5 years, I would say.
And where are you seeing the growth in the market? I mean, I just, having seen quite a few collection shops, I mean, there's still spreadsheets are still around in some of the places. I mean, how much of an opportunity there is in terms of not just putting better workflow in place, and obviously, I mean, where does that fit in terms of, I suppose, the market in terms of like, in terms of where's the opportunity?
I think for us the opportunity is twofold. You have got people who have in the collection space, and certainly also within either the financial services, the fintech, or the smaller dedicated lending space, who are using maybe older systems, who are using stuff that worked for a while, but are not becoming fit for purpose anymore. There are lots of different ways of now doing inbound and outbound comms with customers that some of these older systems don't have the kind of the ability to communicate in the same way that DebtView, our product, does, but also don't have the ability, I mentioned patching, for example, don't have the ability to update in the same way, because it's all based on a server sitting somewhere, and you use it until you can't use it anymore. And then, Chris, you've got people who have got spreadsheets, you've got people who are managing that. There's a lot of commercial collection recovery work. Insolvency and company insolvencies, whilst they're not going through the roof, I was actually having a chat with an insolvency company this week, and what they're actually seeing is there's a lot of companies that are right up to the line and that are struggling, and there are a lot of zombie companies out there where they don't even know that they could fall over. So it's people like that where we're able to come in, or products such as ours are able to come in and help them sort themselves out quickly and efficiently. Because that's it. It's about speed to recognise your problem and rectify it as well.
And what do you see the main problem in terms of like their collections process? Is it? I mean, are the collections problems that I suppose you see that you're brought in to fix? Is it basic workflow? Is it comms? Is it what are the big things that are really missing in those kind of areas?
I mean, what would you say? I would say there's a lot of manual systems, or there's a lot of systems that are built almost replicating a manual system digitally, if you like.
Yes. I mean, historically, there's been the big players in the industry, and the smaller businesses have, as we've just discussed, smaller businesses have been using spreadsheets, and there wasn't much in the middle for the from the very small collection agencies up to the big players. There wasn't much in the middle for anybody. So you either had to just plod along with your cheap old DOS-based system or your spreadsheet or whatever it was, or spend lots and lots of money for an over-engineered system that half of which you'll never use. So that's the gap for us. And our ambition, if you like, is to make some of those more enterprise type features and functionality available to the smaller businesses. Now, obviously, all of them, they're not all relevant and they're not all affordable, but as much as we can, we want to bring all of that functionality down to the smaller businesses. And because I believe they've been underserved for decades probably. So that's where we sit, sort of SMEs.
And there's conversations that I'm having as well around ROI for this kind of thing, because as Mark said, there's all sorts of things people haven't been able to access because the spend from some of the providers of these services and the pricing models are all geared at larger volume players. So you're not able to get into the playground and play because you can't afford to even get the bare minimum level of service.
And go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, there's also cost of acquisition and development costs to bear in mind, because the one thing that cloud has done is it's made it easier and not necessarily cheaper, but probably I'd say more cost effective to spin up a service and develop a prototype system and get something out there to market. And that's the same for whether you're selling a product or whether you're having something built bespoke for you. You don't need a team of developers anymore. You do, but there are different skill sets that you need now. You certainly don't need engineers so much. We, for example, when we first started out, we had from our initial design to our first production system took us 6 months, which was incredible. You just couldn't have done that in before the cloud. And it was the early days of Azure, by the way, were quite interesting because as all things Microsoft, version 1 is always a bit flaky, but we got there in the end, and it is a brilliant product, and it's constantly evolving.
And what's changed there to sort of like take out that development cost? Is it Azure that's sort of taken that out, that allows you just to set these things up much quicker? I mean, is that what's been the game changer in terms of enabling that?
Well, it's the development is still the development. There's no difference there necessarily, but it's the ability to spin up a couple of test machines and test servers and or even deliver them as services as opposed to software on a standalone server. So it's the delivery, I guess, the delivery and the infrastructure behind it that has become easier to maintain and easier for developers to work with. And the deployment model is much simplified. You don't have to worry about getting into networks and upgrading servers and all the rest of it.
Yeah. And how do you think, I suppose, the other big advantage is scalability, but also adding in new features? I mean, is that something that, I mean, you talked about new features, Mark, there just a bit about, how do you give some of those new features? I mean, does that cascade across all clients? I mean, are we getting into almost like this one-stop shop where you have almost like standard services, but they sort of grow, and that's the advantage versus having, bespoke versions of the system? I mean, where do you sort of see it evolving from here?
Well, we try and resist bespoke coding if we can, because it just complicates things. So we are very much a single solution.
This is what you get.
But it's yes and no. This is how it gets delivered. But if you want any changes, we'll certainly consider them. But they're all configurable, and if we build this for you, then it will also be available for all of our other customers. However, if you want something completely bespoke and for your own benefit, then we can talk about that.
And that's where cloud really comes into its own, because not only are you adding sort of distinctiveness and development to a customer, effectively most of the time you're actually adding that same distinctive and development to all of your customers. So you're, as a client, let's say you're a small financial service, let's say you're a fintech startup, we can come to you and say, here's a new development that we're going to be rolling out to the platform. You can have that added, or it will become part of the features in the background. So you don't also have to have people constantly looking and saying, all right, what do we need to do? going to the developer, having the conversation with the developer, scheduling and all that kind of thing. So it's community is a misleading word because nobody's data is linked. But it's more about the fact that because you have everybody looking at it, and also, we're also constantly looking as well. And we don't drive all our product development from our clients by any means. It's Mark and the guys do a lot of that, and then we roll that out to people. So it's this constantly evolving service, which you don't get if you buy a package that sits on your server. You don't get it to the same degree, certainly. You have to wait for updates, softwares, optional purchases, the sales guy coming in, all that kind of stuff.
A lot of us will have processes in collections, and it's the way it's always been like that. And I think that's the best way because I'm vested into that process. But sometimes you might want to take a step back and say, well, actually, the process could run equally as well, if not better, and it would fit into like a standard framework that then gives you resiliency going forward for the next sort of 5-10 years, and you can change it, right? And that always becomes, this is why you end up getting bespoke type systems, because people want to stay over here with what they know rather than actually changing their process and going to something that actually is probably better thought through and still works the same, right?
Yeah, great. We have that quite often actually. We have an example just last week on a call. The customer was asking, or prospect was asking, how do I check my accounts to see if the payments have come in on a given day? And we're saying, well, you don't really need to. They either come in or they don't, and the system will take care of it. If it pays, then fine. If it doesn't pay, then your workflows will take over, and the system will do what you've configured it to do. Oh, but how do I check? How do I go through each account and make sure they've come in? Well, why would you want to, sort of thing? And that's just what they've always done. Yeah. So what they hadn't kind of grasped is that if you set it up properly, and this ought to be the same for all systems, really. If you set it up properly, you just should never need to look at it. You ought to be able to set, especially with the integrations with emails and SMS and WhatsApp and all the rest of it, set it off running on a workflow. Those run overnight, those run automatically, and the letters get sent out, the emails go, and a human should never really need to look at an account manually unless something's happened on it, and that's just prompt them when they need to do something, but otherwise just let the system do its thing.
Yeah. I mean, do you think we got a tendency to make collections too complicated? And it was sort of like, a lot of us in the industry have been there a while, and we talk about the things on the edge of it, right? So it's around decisioning matrices, or we're making it almost like as complex as we possibly can, and probably we're all a bit guilty of that at some point. Yeah. Do you think it's too complicated, and actually we just need to, for the vast majority, just make it a lot simpler? I mean, is that a fair criticism maybe of us, and we just got to think about things maybe a little bit differently?
Well, from my, I'm going to assume for Ian as well, we're of an age where when I was a collector, there wasn't very little regulation for one thing. So, it was almost like the Wild West. I kind of left the industry just as the regulation had started to come in and all the rest of it. And I think we had a compliance officer at one point, which was new to everybody, and that changed the game for a lot of companies. And when we started this business, we saw more new companies starting up as B2B collectors because it was just too difficult to get a CSA license. Just took forever. So the compliance has been a massive change, and this is not a recent thing clearly, but and I think going to your question, I think the complexity probably feels like it's kind of been driven by the desire to do something different than your competitors, because all of the big players, you're right, debt collection is a fairly simple process at the heart of it, but every system did the same or does the same, and the processes are identical. So how do you find a niche, and how do you what's your USP? And so I think, I'm not saying the complexity has been invented, but it's grown out of a need to try and distinguish.
I'd agree with what Mark says. I think, and also if you look at things like on the consumer side, for example, if you look at now how kind of vulnerability is key, far more key. The very old phrase used to be cash is king. Identifying vulnerability, first of all, that was a very manual process because it was all about, how do you talk to people, how do you find out. Well, now you've got ways that they can be identified. You've got the vulnerability registration. You've got the ways that flags and markers and things. And so that kind of sort of engineered with a small e complexity that you kind of needed at first. And I do think there are people who've been guilty of kind of letting that roll on a little bit. And then you bring in something new. So it was all about robots. Then it's all about AI. Then it's all about these other things. But at the heart of it, all of those things will calm down, and then you get they just turn into, or should turn into, quite a simple process. But I think you're right, Chris. I think there are people who can let things stay complicated because it kind of suits. But once you identify an issue, once you identify what the noise is around an issue or a process, then there's almost always a simple way through it once you've identified what your key markers are.
I just kind of wonder, I mean, a lot of these conversations there, I can have really interesting, intellectually, it's a very interesting conversation to have about the complexity and how you can do this, and but it might only be applicable if you've got really large volumes, as an example, and and if you don't have large volumes, and it might just be intellectually interesting, but does it really make a difference? And maybe there's only 3 or 4 things that actually make a difference. I do think vulnerability is probably one of them. That's definitely that's come through, but it just becomes quite a straightforward process in many ways, and you don't have to have all of the features just to really get the value. A lot of it's about having processes that work, right?
It's having processes that enable you to do what you need to do. Collections is all about establishing relationships with customers. So it's all about how you're contacting that customer, how that customer wants to be contacted, and how you best resolve the issue for that customer, identifying things like vulnerability as part of that process. The days of people getting to speak to somebody and then sticking them on a payment plan for the next 5 years, they've all gone. So it's now about just enabling companies to do that quickly and efficiently, because the other sort of benefit to both cloud computing and kind of the drive of simple process is about the cost to serve for that customer as well, and the cost for the company themselves. The cost of living is increasing, but also so is the cost of having a business, the cost of running that business, and you've got to get that balance right. And over-engineered processes on the whole add to cost, add to your OPEX, and that's the kind of thing you've got to keep an eye on as well.
It's interesting there that you mentioned contacting the customer how they want to be contacted, because that's actually a relatively new thing, isn't it? That's probably the big thing at the moment. I would suggest that it's all now about the customer, and how does that customer want to engage with us, not how do we find the customer and how do we convince him to pay. It's about how can we make it easier for them to contact us, and that's still emerging, and that's things like WhatsApp and Facebook now is quite a popular tool, and that I think will continue, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing that customers is the forefront of it.
Where do you sort of see it evolving from here? If you look out into the future in terms of collections and sort of like you talk about simplified processes or building relationships, I mean, where do you think it goes next from here, do you think? Because we have been on a journey for the last 10 years, I mean, for sure. We're now talking about maybe we need to have simpler processes, but basic processes that work. Maybe it's around having better communication with customers, earlier communication, those kind of things. I mean all that seems sort of still quite basic. I mean, where does it evolve, do you think, from here? I mean, what's the future of collections, do you think?
I think it's already started. I think AI for the next 5 years is going to be massive. Artificial intelligence, machine learning. It's the current big thing, isn't it? And obviously you've got crypto around the corner. That once that becomes embedded, but AI is going to be the massive thing. The thing that drives AI, of course, though, is data. So to get the best out of your AI, you need to be willing or able to share data in massive volumes. It's no good just doing. It doesn't really help a company where if we're serving smaller businesses that have got maybe 200,000 cases,
Mm.
it's just not going to work for the smaller people at the moment. So we need to find a way to leverage a shared pool of data if that's possible. Anonymized, obviously. But yeah, for sure, AI is going to.
AI, things like open banking, things like, and open banking in the proper sense, and the more we move away from, certainly within the banking industry and within those sort of circles, the more we move away from having things that are replicated on decades-old business practices, like payments taking 3 days to clear and all that kind of stuff. The more that all that stuff becomes just natively held, and then people just get used to it being accessed.
Yeah.
I've done, a fair bit of work with in America, and bizarrely, they're much more open to the whole open banking, where your lender then looks at your bank account, than we are in the UK.
Yeah. You do kind of wonder. I mean, do you ever sort of sit there? It's probably, for me, it's usually about 3 a.m, at least anyway, so you wake up and think, like, wouldn't it be amazing if everything could link together? So open banking, you're starting to see information getting linked together. But actually, if everything could be linked together, so it's, take, for example, even like the debt advice sector as an example, and you suddenly see, or credit bureaus, we started to do this, but if we really could have integration, how powerful that could be in terms of like linkage to, to government type stuff, but also vulnerability stuff. I mean, and just all the way along, because rather than having separate silos of information, entering data multiple times, it would just be, could be incredibly powerful. I mean, and I know there's privacy hesitation around doing it, but it feels like that's the way the world is going.
That's the way the government are kind of are sort of pushing. Government with a small g. That's the way with. Certainly with things like breathing space and breathing space notice, that's a really good example of how it's now not just down to the customer to say to somebody, I'm talking about death advice and on breathing space. It's about how that information is now being shared out to all possible creditors, and you've all got to do that. So it's not reliant on the customer telling people anymore. And that's the kind of that's the way that's going. But also, to be perfectly blunt, the customers that most of our clients are speaking to now are far younger than we are.
Yeah.
And so they don't have any experience of the kind of the non-native digital way of doing things.
Yeah.
Trying to explain to my daughters about how things were. They look at me like I'm insane.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it is. The moment that the people who push things forward, the people who create things, the moment that you lose that sort of, I don't know, let's even say pre-90s kind of people, then you'll find there'll be, I think, an upturn. That's why you're seeing things like, Azure is 10 years old, Mark?
Yep.
Azure
about 12.
Yeah, look at the changes in the last few years, the exponential increase. The way that a few years ago, if you talked about cloud with government, local government, or banking, people were like, it's not secure. But now, because it was all about ring fencing your own particular application, but now when you look at the kind of the stuff that's being natively built into cloud from security, people are much more comfortable with it, and that's because those things are now being driven by people who live and breathe that world and always have. And that's where we'll start to see over the next few years that kind of massive increase in cloud. You mentioned things like netbooks, and I've got a MacBook that's got very little memory on it, but soon they'll be built and designed with just that in mind, and people won't have the. I mean, the phone is a really good example. I save tons on my phone. My daughters don't, because they all store it in the different cloud application.
Well, Mark and Ian, thanks very much for the chat. So it's very interesting. It's I think I take my takeaway is sort of like it's back to basics and getting that right, but you can do that in a cost-effective way and sort of like and then get ready for what's coming down the pipe at us, which is and there's probably benefit in that as well, big benefit in that for the time.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, really appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Great to speak to you.
We'll chat to you soon.
Okay.
Lovely. Cheers, Chris.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
See you later.
Bye bye. Well, I for one welcome our new robot overlords.
As long as they can make a cup of tea.
Yeah.